So in the last video, we looked at the differences between our three different data types available in the C# programming language for working with floating point numbers. So here's an example in Visual Studio of what you can and can't do between these different data types when working with mathematical values of float, double, and decimal. And I've also included integers, so we can look at a little bit of this. So up here I have declared a float, and when we're using literal values of float, so anytime we actually want to put a literal number value into a floating variable type, we have to use the F. And that denotes that we are making that into a literal float value. With double, we can store any decimal place value that we want. We talked about the number of characters that's allowed in the last video. And similar to float, and we talked about this in a previous video, anytime we're turning a literal number into a decimal value, we use the M to denote the level of precision that we were putting that into a decimal. And then I have an integer value as well. So some of the things you can do. It is legal to take a float and a double and put them both into a double variable with doing a mathematical function. So the floating point value, the double value, we can add them together. We can put them into a double. There's no problem with that. We can take the double value and an integer value, or a floating value and an integer value. There's going to be no problem performing mathematical operations on those and storing them into type double or into type float. There's no problem taking decimal values and integer values and storing them into decimals. So there's not going to be any syntax problem with those. So those are all legal to perform with any of the mathematical functions that we've talked about. Now you notice the underlines for the syntax problems that I have on three of these. We cannot take a floating point value and a double value and put those into a float. So where that was legal when the result will be placed in a double, it is not legal when the result will be placed in a float, simply because the outcome could be larger than the value that the float can hold. Since floats hold less than doubles, the value stored in this variable, it could be larger than what this can ultimately hold. So this is not going to be legal without, and it talks about it cannot implicitly convert it. We have to have a cast on there to say, yes, we do want to do this and understand the risks involved, because if we have a value too large in our double and we add that to the float, it may not be able to hold it here in this variable, and that's going to cause a runtime issue. Same thing down here. We cannot take a floating point value and a double value and put it into a decimal simply because the two data types do not convert. So if we cast it and actually take these two values, cast them into decimal before placing this in the decimal variable type, we can do that. There's either cast or convert, which we'll talk about in a later video. You can perform either one in order to make this statement legal. Finally, our last example, we cannot take a floating point value and add it to a decimal value. In fact, you'll notice that this is an entirely different error message than the previous two, where the operator plus cannot be applied to these two different types of operands. It doesn't even know what to do with this. There is nothing you can do to make this legal. It is not going to be the kind of conversion that you can make. So you would either need to make this a decimal value, or you would have to use something with less precision. But ultimately, if you're trying to take a floating point value and put that into a decimal, it's not something that's ultimately going to work out. So when you're doing math with various floating point data types, remember to think back to what kind of precision do I want, how many decimal places do I need to store, and so that will help you with choosing the correct floating point data type that you need to use for your project.